Hello everyone and welcome to the Dyslexia Life Hack Show. I'm your host Matthew Head, and in this episode I'm talking to Dr. David Hurford. He is a research scientist and professor at Pittsburgh State University. He's also the founder of Center for the Assessment and Remediation for Reading Difficulties, or CARD, a non-profit organisation that assists dyslexics to be competent readers. He's also an author with books focused on dyslexia, and one that particularly piqued my interest was I Have Dyslexia, which is aimed at children. As always, there'll be extended show notes uploaded to dyslexialifehacks.com/podcast. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm really happy to be here.
No problem at all. Where I thought I'd kick today's episode off with today is your interest in pursuing a career as a professor in education. Where did the spark of that come from?
Well, that actually is an interesting story.
Good. We like them.
If you had asked me when I was 4 or 5 years old what I wanted to be when I grew up, I'd have told you I wanted to be a scientist.
Right.
And astronomy and astrophysics were really the things I was interested in. In fact, we moved from where I lived as a child to a different state for a year. And our neighbor said, if there's anything you want in your house, we can send it to you. And I wanted my astronomy book. And so they sent that to me. And when I got into high school, I realized that humans were way more interesting. I still like astrophysics and astronomy. You know, my favorite celestial body, obviously, besides the sun. Without it, we wouldn't exist. But I like the moon and seeing the phase of the moon and seeing what's going on up there. And when I was in college, I realized my interest in humans that I kind of acquired in high school actually has a science to it as well, which is psychology. And so I studied psychology, and in my doctoral program, I studied developmental psychology because I'm very interested in how people evolve over their lifespan. And one of the courses that we were required to take in the doctoral program was psychology of learning disabilities. And everything that was in that class just lit me on fire. I loved it. Neuropsychology, learning, cognition, information processing, sensation, perception, language, speech, all of it was involved. And we had to we were required to create research proposals based on what we were learning. And that became my dissertation, and that worked out fairly well and was published in the Journal of Experimental Child Psychology. And then that made me think of the next study and then the next study. And before too long, we were really interested in why children were failing to learn how to read. And my early work was really with identification, how we could identify children accurately before they began learning to read, and see if we could figure that piece out, which we did. And then the next piece is, well, if you can accurately identify kids early on, then you need to do something about that. You know, it's not like, okay, you're going to have dyslexia.
Right.
Figure out the rest of your life. You know, it's, hey, you have a high potential of having reading failure. You know, what can we do about it? And we develop strategies that we continue to use today at the Center for Reading at Pittsburgh State University to work with children and adults who are struggling readers with great success. So, you know, for me, the interest in science is where it's at. Science is the definition of science, in my view, is to help us understand what reality is. Like today we live in a post-fact life. You know, you can make stuff up. You can put anything you want to online, and there's going to be people who believe that. But for scientists, you know, like for me, I don't believe anything until I see some data. And so to have the opportunity where you can apply science, figure some things out, and then it actually helps people, that's just like super bonus. You know, it's, you know, because we see kids at our center here as early as kindergarten, which are, you know, 5-year-old kids who already have anxiety about going to school because they see some of their peers who are learning how to read. And all children who go to school want to learn how to read. In fact, you know, when your kids are at home and they're scribbling and you're like, what are you doing? They're like, I'm writing. You know, they're highly motivated to learn how to read and write. And then we get to school and find out, wow, this is really a pretty terrible. I must not be very smart. And my teacher's not helping me because he or she doesn't know how to help me. And I'm not figuring this stuff out, so I just must be fairly not as smart as I thought I was, which is sad because that's absolutely not true. And then in first grade, we see anxiety morphing into depression. And when I mean anxiety, like for parents who are listening, who I know probably most of the people who are listening are parents, when your child says things like, oh, I've got a tummy ache today, I don't feel good, I don't want to go to school. And you're like, well, let's take your temperature, and oh, you don't seem like you're sick. That's anxiety. It's a real physical manifestation of their feelings. And when you really want to learn something, and it looks like everyone else is learning how to learn to read, and you're not, you think something's wrong with you. And there's nothing wrong with that child, nothing whatsoever. It's just, they didn't come into the world with a brain that was built to essentially learn how to read. And so we figured out strategies how to help these kids. And it doesn't just help them academically, but it helps them psychologically and emotionally and every which other way. I mean, learning to read in today's society is a basic human right. And when we fail to provide reading instruction for people such that they don't learn how to read, that's a systematic failure. And in the United States, much like in Great Britain and other places that they're learning how to read with the English writing system, which is quite challenging. It's tough. It's tough. And we know how to do that. So it's time that we all get in the same boat and row in the same direction and help these kids out.
Oh, yes, most definitely. So cycling back to your university studies where you said you started doing a course on learning difficulties that lit you up, would that be the first time you'd ever kind of come into contact with people with learning difficulties? Or was there memories that you had from earlier on that suddenly clicked into place as you were doing this course?
Yeah, no, it was my coursework. I really didn't know that people didn't learn how to read easily. I mean, as a child, I must have learned how to read pretty easily because I don't really remember it. Although, I'm in that generation that learned how to read with the Dick and Jane books. See Spot run, 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 run. See Jane run, 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 run. And that's that notion that if we show kids the words and tell them what the words are, they'll eventually memorize them all, which actually turns out to be a terrible way to teach reading because the alphabetically based writing systems that we have, of which the English writing system is one of the most challenging. I mean, French is pretty challenging as well. So when we have writing systems that are like that, we have to teach that it's a code. And if you teach students that the sounds they're hearing in their language and the words they know in their language are actually represented by letters to represent those various sounds, and that you have to learn how to decode and how to use that. For example, if you're reading the word, dog, you go d, g, and then you synthesize them together, dog, dog, dog. Well, that's how we learn how to read. I mean, we have to show that it's a code, and if we don't show them it's a code, then kids try and figure out other ways to learn how to read, and it just doesn't work that way.
No, and especially with English language where it throws around the same combination of letters at 4 different sounds, depending on what words are around it and letters and stuff, which gets entertaining.
Yeah, and that's why the English writing system is so challenging, because sometimes people ask me, well, if there's dyslexia, it's a part of the normal human genome experience, does language actually, or the writing system actually affect dyslexia? And the answer is yes. Because, there's some languages whose writing systems are what we call, surface level or transparent. And those are systems like Spanish and Italian, Greek, Finnish, where one letter essentially represents one sound. And that sound is only ever represented by that one letter. So even though they are challenged with decoding, the decoding system is so easy that eventually they figure that out. And like in the German literature, they talk about slow readers rather than non-readers. In the United States, we have nearly 40% of our children who are reading below the basic level on the National Assessment of Educational Progress in Reading, which is given every 2 years. 40% below basic. Basic means you have the skills, you just haven't really figured out how to use them yet. Below basic means you don't even have the skills. So when we're talking about over a third of our nation of fourth graders who are not performing very well in reading, and what I mean by performing not very well, they're struggling readers who are belabored readers that, and as human beings, we tend to do things that we like and we're good at. We tend to like things we're good at and those kinds of things, and we avoid things we're not. And so children who struggle to learn how to read, I've seen third and fourth graders who are basically checked out. They're just done with school. And here in the United States, we brag about a 97 or 98% graduation rate in high school, but that's only counting kids who started high school. If you start looking from kindergarten through high school age, you find it's more like 71 to 83%. And that's just terrible. So we wonder why, people don't understand science very well. Well, firstly, when you learn how to read, it changes the way your brain is organized. It lends itself more likely to be able to think critically and then evaluate data. So, today, as I said earlier, we have people who basically just believe that, say, an election was stolen and we should need to storm the Capitol of the United States to stop that. But if they could read, they would find out that's absolutely was not true. Or, that autism is caused by vaccines, or, lots of issues, right? That actually have a huge impact on our national health. And of course, Andrew Wakefield kind of started that nonsense in Great Britain. He said that vaccines were causing autism. Then, of course, over here, people just went nuts. And so now we're seeing more cases of measles and things that were gone. So, reading is critically important. It's not just for school. It's how you get along in life. If you can't read, you can't apply for a loan or a driver's license or an application for an apartment or anything, really. So, it's just critically important.
Definitely, and you are right to highlight that point, actually, particularly with some of the misinformation or misrepresentation of information, not having the reading ability to look behind what is going on and having to rely on, I guess, talking heads in a mobile phone screen or whatever you do that is not reading. And the basic stuff, just being able to read through stuff, ingredients, recipes, whatever you need to do.
Yeah, we had a person who, for whatever, this person had family issues and ended up living at our house when he was a senior in high school. And he had dyslexia, although I did not know that prior to that. And we'd go out to a restaurant and I'd say, you can eat anything you want. You can order anything you want. And he always ordered chicken fingers. And I couldn't figure that out. And then I realized he knew chicken fingers was going to be on the restaurant because that's something over here. There's a high probability. So he didn't have to say, I can't read. I'm just going to order chicken fingers every time.
Yeah. That's a good hack.
Yeah. Well, that just shows that people who have dyslexia are very bright and they look for workarounds because, if you can't read, how can you work around so you can get graduated from high school? How do you work around so you can get employed? So for the most part, I think people who have dyslexia are certainly, very intelligent, very clever, creative people, by virtue, if nothing else, the condition in which they're in.
Yeah. I think sort of sometimes necessity is the mother of all invention, isn't it? If you
absolutely, it is.
Struggling with the reading, then you find alternative ways. Yeah, like always ordering the steak.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So you've done sort of over 30 years of research in dyslexia and other neurodiversities as well. Now, when you've been going along, that's a lot of thinking has changed over 30 years. What sort of things have particularly jumped out at you and really piqued your interest as you're doing research? Like, that changes my thoughts on this wholesale, or does it not work like that?
Well, I've been doing it so long that in reality, early on certainly is like, wow, this is fascinating. I just, the whole area is just absolutely fascinating. And, I was interested in working with older adults in gerontology. And when I took that course, it pivoted. And I've not strayed from that course since. And every day I wake up excited to, do this work. It's absolutely fascinating work. But the thing for me that I think, doesn't directly answer your question, the research, everything I read, I still find fascinating. But I think the thing that's really fascinating is that, the history of why we started teaching reading in a way that actually wasn't good for kids. And that was, in the history of the United States, Horace Mann, who was a progressive educator, quite some time ago, thought that, we needed to get to meaning very, very quickly when we're teaching kids to read, so they'd be excited to read. My guess is he probably learned how to read with no problems, one of those lucky few who just, it makes sense to them from the very beginning, which there's not many of them. Not many of us. We generally have to be taught to read, but there's some individuals with minimal instruction get it. And he basically said we shouldn't do what he called, like the drill and kill. He said that letters were ghastly, ghostly, terrible things. We shouldn't be focusing on letters. We should be focusing on meaning. And granted, the whole point of learning how to read is for meaning, to comprehend what we're reading. Not necessarily, was he crazy for thinking that, but he didn't consider that, essentially alphabetic writing systems are codes that you have to teach kids how to do the code piece. And so for me, what's interesting, over the last 100 years, with Orton and Gillingham and doing the work they did, particularly Samuel Orton, who was very interested in why kids fail to learn how to read. The last 40 or 50 years, we've had just a mushroom of enormous amount of research that's been done with reading. At this point in time, it's pretty safe to say we don't know everything, but we certainly know enough how to teach nearly every kid to be a competent reader. No doubt whatsoever. And the last 50 years, we've known this, but every decade since, and every year, there's hundreds of thousands of things that I've learned and published. But I think for us in the United States, a couple of things that really has happened. Number one, the science has always been there. We know the science. The science modifies itself and corrects itself as we learn more. No doubt whatsoever about that. But in 2011, 4 or 5 parents in one of the states here, New Jersey, they, on the East Coast, they travel by train, and they were traveling to conferences on train and talking about and bemoaning and commiserating about the fact that the schools weren't necessarily helping their kids with dyslexia. And they said, you know what? We're tired of that. And so they created an organization called Decoding Dyslexia. And at the time, it was 4 or 5 parents. When I found out about them 2 years later, they were in 47 of the 50 states and 2 of the 10 provinces in Canada. So, what they were saying, other parents are going, exactly, that's the same problem we're experiencing. And now they're in all 50 states and 4 of the 10 provinces in Canada, and probably have some of an international reputation. And they went to state legislators and said, we need to do something about this reading crisis that's happening. And so states started writing laws about how we should be teaching reading. And then an education reporter named Emily Hanford did a series of podcasts examining why we got into this mess in the first place. And it's called Sold a Story. And I would certainly recommend, people listening to that because, what's happening in Great Britain and Australia and New Zealand, those things are all happening here in the United States. So we talk about how our methods of teaching reading, they're kind of aligned with elsewhere. Now, in Great Britain, you do synthetic phonics more so than a lot of other places, and certainly a good way of teaching reading. But, we're still facing a reading crisis. So, we need to get people trained before they become teachers in the field how to teach reading and to get that rolling. So for me, kind of the most important piece was aligning other people with the science of reading. That's for me the most important thing, is to get that aligned so that we can teach kids properly, and then kids won't suffer psychologically, emotionally. I think for me, that's kind of the big area.
Yes. So it is, and I sort of circled anxiety on my notepad when you were mentioning it earlier. You are totally right with everybody being anxious. So obviously you set up CARD as a way of putting reading intervention in. So let's start with the identification. Well, first of all, why did you set that up outside of your sort of research science and professor studies?
Well, that's actually a good question. And it had to do more with internal politics at the university. and so I wanted to keep things viable, and I wanted to go beyond the university. Like in our area is a high poverty area, and probably it was the late 1990s, a parent called me and said, "Hey, can my child be evaluated at your center?" And we're like, "Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things we do here." And I said, "Absolutely." And they said, "Well, we live kind of a distance away." I said, "We can do it on the weekend. We'll accommodate parents and families in a way we want to." And they said, "Well, we're actually 500 miles away. Is there anywhere else around us that are like you?" And I'm like, "Not really." And so at the time I thought, well, with the internet kind of getting up and muscled up, and I really like writing computer code. So I did the HTML for a site that actually put our evaluation instrument online. At the center here, we evaluate for reading issues and psychological emotional issues and attentional issues. Because when kids are younger, if you see them struggling in their classroom, you don't know, are they struggling because they have attentional issues, or are they struggling because you're giving them material that they don't understand? What's the issue? So we always evaluate on attention as well to see if they may have ADHD or some kind of attentional problem. So we couldn't do that piece online, but we could do the piece that looked at, which really is our dyslexia evaluation tool, that looks at phonological processing, decoding, synthesizing, spelling, and comprehension. And so we wrote that and put it online. And actually parents in Great Britain and beyond, anywhere, they can get on. The site is called dyslexia101.com. And on that site, there's an evaluation tool you can use. It's our dyslexia evaluation tool. You can do it for free. It will take you about 45 minutes to an hour to complete with your child. But we did research and found that parents, because, one of the things you're worried about, well, if you give this to parents, certainly they're not going to be as accurate as professionals trained how to do evaluations. And unfortunately, the tools that you need to evaluate a child, you need training for, like the comprehensive test of phonological processing, or an IQ test, or some other reading tool. You have to have graduate training and coursework before a publishing company will allow you to have that, or a testing company will allow you to have that. So we did research to look at, were parents as accurate as individuals who are trained professionals? And so we did a study that looked at that and found out that actually parents are really good, as long as they're accurate in terms of how their kid is performing. And so the results that we found were quite good. So that they can go online and actually, like, as soon as I hear this, they go, "Wait a minute, let's put this on pause and I'll go evaluate my child." And you can do it for free. That's for me, it's really important that, right now in many cultures across the globe, the haves are few and the have-nots are great. And if we keep making that schism between the haves and the have-nots greater, well, firstly, it's immoral and unethical. But secondly, what we find out in human history is if you squat on the have-nots long enough, they'll get strong and big and they'll just tear you down. Because it's our right to have, a decent life. And if we just become essentially the slaves of the people who own all the stuff, we don't like that. So for me, it's really important that, people who don't necessarily have the ability to afford a $2,000 to $10,000 or 5,000 pound evaluation for dyslexia, that they can come to our center and get one that's based on family income. And so we have some people who come to our center who may be a single parent with a couple of kids, works at a place that doesn't give benefits. So we may not charge them much or nothing at all. So anyway, the Dyslexia 101 site was our attempt to provide some evaluation tools for free, and then also to provide online intervention for people that was based on the intervention we do here, but online, in person, real time. So, yeah, the Card Inc. is what we call nonprofit here. And, the Center for Reading on the Pittsburgh State University campus is, obviously universities are not for profit. And several years ago, I wanted to write a children's book to help kids who came to our center know what dyslexia is all about. Because I think a lot of times children think, well, I'm the only one who has this issue. It's me that's problematic. It's not the system. And so, we wrote these. One's a boy version and one is a girl version. It's called I Have Dyslexia. And actually, a bunch of people in the United Kingdom purchased these online through Amazon. But we originally wrote them for our kids who came here. And then other people like, hey, we want those books. But one of the benefit for me was not just telling kids that you're not alone. Here's what dyslexia is about. It's a neurobiological issue. Your brain is a little bit different in this regard, but your brain is also pretty cool and can do some other things, and how we can do those things, right? And I wanted to write one for boys and one for girls because at the time I wrote them, 80% of the main characters of children's books were males. And one of the best things that happened in the United States, besides civil rights laws and those types of things, and rights for kids and for people to go to school who had disabilities, but was Title IX, which allowed, women to participate in sports and all the way through their schooling. Because as males, you learn about yourself by participation in sports. If you're a runner, you understand that what you get out of running is what you put into it. Like if you're a really good runner, you put a lot of something into it, right? And in high school, you can be a good runner, not have necessarily, that strange genetics that just allows you to be, a superhuman runner. Competing in high school, you can be good at a lot of sports because it's not such an extremely high level of specificity. But what's important is that you learn about yourself, that what you put into something. Like in music, the more you practice, the better you get. And if in theater, memorizing your lines are going to be better. Just everything you learn about yourself by participation. And so for girls to participate in sports, I thought was important. But half the people who have dyslexia are females. Like almost everything else that can go wrong in humans happens to males 3 to 4 times more frequently than it happens in females. Take almost anything. Depression, more male situation. We used to think that it was mostly a female situation, but it turns out dudes were lying. And they were self-medicating with alcohol. So, there's a lot of depression that occurred in males. Probably the only thing, if you look at almost anything that can be different, it happens more in males than females, except for dyslexia. And of course, autoimmune disorders mostly affect women to the tune of 80% women, 20% men. But, it was important for me that girls had their own book. I Have Dyslexia book was just for them. And then we wrote 2 others for kids of color. That was good. And here we have a fairly large Spanish population. So, we translate them into Spanish, so, but for me, those books, were important to write to be an education for people. And, there's a cost to them, obviously, but it's the lowest cost I could do and still get it out there. So not very much.
So is that more of a factual kind of thing about dyslexia, or is it more of a story arc that weaves in the main character understanding their dyslexia?
Yeah, it's the first. It's, it's factual. It's like, it talks about, that you're not alone, in a classroom of 20 kids, there's probably about 5 or 6 kids who might have dyslexia and even greater who are struggling with reading, what the term dyslexia means, and then goes into a little bit of the brain processing stuff. And what we found over the years is, when we first would tell parents, we do the evaluation and then we do a parent feedback session. And parents, almost 30 years ago when we started this Center for Reading here, they would weep. They were sad. Oh my gosh, this is something that's, we didn't know what was, and maybe at home they're like, we're going to get you to learn how to read. Dang it. You're not going to do anything until you learn how to read. And then they were like, oh, this is not something that was a motivation problem or a desire problem. It was a brain structure problem. And they would frequently weep at the parent feedback sessions. And, fast forward to now, kids will say, oh, I'm so relieved. It's dyslexia. There's not anything wrong with me. I have dyslexia. And I think part of that is that, if you would Google the term dyslexia in the year 2000, yeah, you'd get some hits on that, but you'd get several million, 10 million hits on dyslexia today. There's lots of information. People understand it. Certainly we can help people become competent readers who have dyslexia, but dyslexia isn't like having cancer. It's something we can do to help. And again, I guess like cancer, it's not their fault, right? So I think that's important that kids understand. It's just something that's unique about them. And, generally there's probably some other things that are unique about them too, that are wonderful things. So that too, I think is important for them to know.
Yes, definitely. It's good to highlight the strengths as well as maybe some of the weaknesses. And interesting hearing your thoughts over 30 years of research, that how attitudes have changed over time.
Well, and they certainly have changed a lot. And one of the things that I think is important for parents to know is, I know parents want to kind of put armor on their kids and get them ready for life and tell them, yeah, you're super smart and you do all these other things great. But the thing that's important is not to tell a child, hey, because you have dyslexia, you also have a superpower. And here's why I don't like that. Because a child is suffering with dyslexia. They don't like it. And they're like, okay, I have dyslexia. It's going to be more challenging for me to learn how to read. Okay, I can do that. But when you tell them, but you also have a superpower, most kids, if you ask them, hey, dyslexia is your superpower, what do you think about that? They're like, hey, can I trade it? I'll trade it with anybody else. If this is a gift, let me give it back to you. I'm not interested in that. And then if we tell them they have a superpower on top of it, they're like, great, let me find my superpower. And then they find out, oh, they don't have a superpower. They're just like everyone else who doesn't have dyslexia. Many of us don't really have superpowers. We just do things we're good at and we work towards it. We don't really have a superpower, an extraordinary ability, right? So for me, it's important because if we tell a kid who's already suffering and struggling with dyslexia they have a superpower, and then they find out they don't, they feel like they were screwed twice. Hey, I have dyslexia, and I don't even have a superpower like everybody else who has dyslexia. It's like, that's the problem. That's the problem. Telling your kids you're super smart and you're wonderful, yeah, they are super smart and they're wonderful. Whatever that means objectively, you can tell your kids they're super smart and they're wonderful. And that you love them unconditionally. All that kind of stuff's important. But when we tell students little fibs or lies that, hey, because you have dyslexia, also have this superpower, let's find out what it is. There's no scientific evidence for that. And for me, like when my kids were growing up, I wanted to be straight shooters with them. When they asked me a question, no matter what it was, they were going to get the scientific, answer that they could understand at the time, the age they were. I'm never going to, sugarcoat or BS them because it doesn't, in the long run, it doesn't help. It just does not help.
No. I think the strengths and weaknesses, like any thing in life, isn't it? But like any person, really. But yeah, superpowers, I think, a bit disingenuous and also alienates people who aren't dyslexic, who think all the dyslexic people are running around thinking they got superpowers.
Yeah. And I mean, we all wish we had superpowers. I mean, why did people love Harry Potter so much? Because he had a superpower. We all want to believe that, right? And, the superheroes and all that, we all want to believe, and we all are a hero to some extent inside of us, but we just don't really, most of us, myself included, we don't really have, what we'd say in the vernacular is a superpower. You're good at interviewing people and getting to the bottom of things. I love science. I like to figure things out. Other people are wonderful painters. Some people are great sculptors, some great musicians. Some people like to get on skyscrapers and weld I-beams together. Those are all important things for us to do collectively, right? So we tend to go with, what we're good at, we tend to do. And, just going off the cliff a little bit, telling kids they have superpowers when they probably don't, in the end actually has a psychological, emotional harm to it. And we don't need to do that.
Fair enough. Yeah. And yeah, you're right. So what I'd like to do before we round the podcast up is I've got 3 rapid fire questions that I'd like to ask every guest that comes on the show. They don't necessarily need rapid fire answers from you, but they are quick questions from myself. So let's dive into question number 1. What prejudice have you had about dyslexia that has been proven wrong?
Well, actually nothing, to be honest with you. Because you have to remember, I got into this on the science end of it. So everything that I learned about it, it was from the science piece of it. And so I was kind of brought up in dyslexia based on the science. And so I almost, I'm kind of a pain to my family at times, like they'll show me something like, well, my wife might say, hey, there's this interesting study that someone's reporting on. And I'll say, but there's 3 alternative hypotheses for that result, right? I go a little crazy at times too. Like there's, advertisements here that and this is years ago, because now it's just ridiculous. I mean, the level of, there used to be what's called truth in advertising, which was a policy here. You had to show some truth to what you're advertising. Now there's absolutely no truth and nobody even cares, so, but back in the day, they'd say, a double-blind university study found, and I'd call them up and say, can you tell me that university double-blind study? Like, what are you talking about? I guess I like to mess with people a little bit too, but, if you're using science to buttress a claim, then you better back it up. Give me the reference so I can read it. That's just kind of how my brain works. I have to be able to evaluate it, take it apart, see what it looks like. Is the methodology sound? Do they use the right statistics? Are the conclusions based on the method and results? Those kinds of things. So for me, I guess I'd really honestly have to say that I didn't really know much about dyslexia before I got into the science part of it, and everything I learned was from the science. So, there's a lot of things that people believe that isn't true, but for example, in the United States, we continue to use what's called a discrepancy formula, meaning that a child has to have much lower reading skills than their intellectual functioning, a discrepancy between their cognitive abilities and their reading ability. And, we know now that, dyslexia runs across the gamut for intellectual functioning. We see like the oldest person that we helped become a fairly competent reader here was 63, and he also had intellectual disability. So, when I say that I think almost all people can become competent readers, I know that there's a percentage that we're probably not going to be able to reach, But I truly think that 95% of people can become what I call competent readers, which means they understand what they're reading well enough to function in life. They're literate people. But we still have that notion that, we need to identify kids based on this discrepancy, and it's just absolutely not true. So.
Okay, and question number 2 of this rapid fire set. If an alien landed and you had to describe dyslexia to them, how would you do it?
That actually is a very timely question.
You met an alien yesterday? No.
Yeah, well, actually, I wish. I hope they're friendly aliens, by the way, because they're portrayed equally as sometimes friendly and sometimes not so friendly.
Yes.
So, yeah, if there are aliens, an extraterrestrial being who makes it to Earth, and they have the technology and ability to do that, I hope they're friendly because we're going to be in trouble if they're not. But actually, you have the Rose report and the Rose definition of dyslexia, and it's quite a lengthy definition. And in the United States, the International Dyslexia Association has its definition of dyslexia, which is somewhat lengthy and has 2 components that I really don't like whatsoever. And so we're actually writing a paper, Linda Siegel and Jamie Matsala and 2 of my colleagues, Michaela Ogier and Alex Fender, are writing a paper on the definition. And for us, I think the simplest is the best. And for us, the definition is if you have a difficult time with word recognition or decoding, you probably have dyslexia. Now, we can add a whole bunch of other stuff that's also true. Like we know that it's, neurobiologically based. But the problem is every human behavior is neurologically based. And every disability that's out there is neurologically based, for the most part, right? So adding neurobiological component doesn't really help us. If we say things like dyslexia, dyslexia is a reading difficulty that occurs unexpectedly, well, that doesn't really help us much either. So for us, it's just really short and simple. If you have a problem with word recognition skills or decoding, you probably have dyslexia. That for us is the definition. And you can talk about spelling and comprehension, all those other things, but that's a function of that problem. And the problem of word recognition and decoding skills. So that's going to be our argument. So that's what I would say to an extraterrestrial being is that, dyslexia is a difficulty where people have a difficult time reading words. And if you can't read words, then you can't comprehend. You can't do other things. So we're going to keep it simple. And then as we actually find things out for certain, we could add to that. But I still think that core truth of it's a problem or a disability where people don't have word recognition skills or decoding. On the flip side, you could say, what if they were never taught to read? Do they still have dyslexia? Well, we'll have to, then teach them how to read. But, it gets complicated in a hurry, right? And people are certainly going to disagree with us. But that's how I would describe it.
No, sounds good to me. And the final question of this rapid fire set, and seeing as this is the Dyslexia Life Hack show, what is your favorite dyslexia life hack?
I hadn't really thought of that. My favorite dyslexia life hack. I guess I would say, believe in yourself and find someone who can teach you what we refer to as structured literacy. It teach you the mechanics of reading. You have the ability to learn how to read. There's no doubt about that. What we found in the literature is that, to teach individuals who have dyslexia to learn how to read requires that we teach the code, that it's structured, it's explicit. We teach those components of it. But as it turns out, the way we should be teaching all children how to read is the very same way. So I think the biggest, for me, the life hack would be, believe in yourself You do have talents and abilities. You are a decent human being. You have something to give to other people, no doubt about that. But find someone that knows how to teach reading, that it's a code, and you're going to become what I define as a competent reader. Again, someone who reads well enough to function in our environment today that requires reading. Just simple as that.
Thank you. So before we sign off, where can people find you, and is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, one of the things that I enjoy is I came to the university that I'm at, which is a small regional institution, because a family were going to be, nearby. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. It's a 5-hour drive from here. Other people were within 2-hour drives from me. So I came here because of that. But because I came to a small institution, I wasn't pigeonholed into one area. So, it's like going to a small high school where you get to be on the soccer team, the football team, in music and theater, and be on the chess team. And you can do all those things because it's a small school. They need people to do it. So you get to do those things. Where if you go to a huge high school, like my high school, my graduating class had 834 people in it. They're highly specialized people with talent. So you didn't get to do some stuff because, quite frankly, you weren't good enough to participate in that arena. So for here, being what I kind of call the Lone Ranger in terms of dyslexia, I was the only one on campus who dealt with dyslexia. I got to look at the science piece of it and to develop strategies to identify and remediate. And we were able to write books. And I have books for adults. I'm writing a series of books. There's going to be a 7-volume series, 2 of which I have written thus far. But I get to write books for adults. I get to write and do lots of different things. So, for me, being in a small institution allowed me to do lots and lots and lots of different things. So that's been really fun because I like to create and then move on to something else. And if I was at a large institution, I'd say, well, you can just create this, and that's what you have to do the rest of the time you're here. And I'm like, yeah, but what about this over here? This looks interesting. So, it's, and being at a university, I get to do basically what I want to do. And I really enjoy that, right? So, what's interesting is, if I would have done what I originally intended was to, work as a developmental psychologist in gerontology, I would be studying myself now because we consider people older than 65 to be older adults. That's the demarcation line is 65. And there's younger older adults, there's middle older adult, and there's older adults. And I'd be in the younger older adult range, but I'd still be an older adult, right? And, being in the field I'm in, I'm still excited. Every morning I'm excited. Like I knew I was going to talk to you today, Matthew, and I was really excited about that. It's fun to talk about things you've been doing for 40 years, And, I roll out of bed excited to get busy doing what I'm going to do that day. And working at a university allowed me to do that. And I don't know when I'm going to stop doing it, probably not anytime soon, but as long as my brain still works, I can still make a contribution. So,
yes, definitely. Yeah.
Some people might question that, but
yeah, we'll leave it up to them to decide then.
Yeah.
Well, that just leaves me to thank you, David, for coming on the show today.
Well, thank you. It's actually a pleasure and somewhat cathartic to talk about the things that we've done and what they can do to help. And for people to know there's answers out there. We don't have to figure out, hey, we need to figure this out. No, it's been figured out. You just need to find access. And
you need to find the right rock to kick over. Yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so, power to those parents out there who are seeking answers. The answers are there. And if they're interested, they can find me at Pittsburgh State University, and that's Pittsburgh without an H. They could probably just Google my name, David P. Hurford, with Hurford, and find me. I'm interested in talking to parents. They're the ones who are seeking answers for their kids. It's very immediate for them to be able to find solutions. And so I'm always interested in talking to parents.
Excellent. Well, that just leaves me to thank everybody else for taking the time to listen to this episode. And I will speak to you in the next episode. Goodbye for now.